Imagine two Premier League clubs. Both have ambitious owners. Both are well run. Both want to improve. And both identify exactly the same £50 million player. At first glance, you'd think the question is simple. Can they afford the 50 million? But under football's financial rules, that's not really how the calculation works. Imagine that a player signs a 5-year contract. Very simply, that 50 million transfer fee could be spread across those 5 years for accounting purposes. That's £10 million per year. Now give him wages of 100 grand a week. That's another 5.2 million a year. So before we even get into agent fees and other relevant costs, that 50 million player could add more than 15 million a year to the club's squad costs. And that's where the difference between Premier League clubs starts to matter. Imagine one club has room for another 20 million of annual squad costs. Signing that player can consume most of the flexibility they have left. The bigger club might have 80 million of room. They could sign the exact same player and still have 60 million of annual squad costs capacity remaining. Enough potentially to add several more major players. Same player, same transfer fee, same league, same financial rules, completely different impact. And that's because the Premier League's new financial system, the amount a club can sustainably spend on its squad, is directly connected to the money available within its financial calculation. And that's where I think things get interesting. Because in theory, the Premier League squad cost ratio rules make a lot of sense. Football clubs shouldn't be allowed to just spend recklessly, rack up enormous losses and gamble their future chasing success. I do completely agree with that. But when squad spending is linked to the money a club generates, there's another question we need to ask. Does this simply make football more financially sustainable? Or does it also make it harder for the clubs below the elite to ever close the gap? Because from 2026 to 27 season, PSR, as we know it, is being replaced. SCR is here, and it could fundamentally change how Premier League clubs build their squads. Why PSR had to change? Before criticising the new system, we need to understand why the Premier League wanted to change things in the first place. For years, we've had PSR, profit and sustainability rules. The basic principle was that the Premier League clubs could only make a certain level of losses over a 3-year period. And again, the intention makes sense. Stop clubs spending money they don't have, stop owners gambling with the football clubs, and hopefully stop situations where a club chases success today and spends the next decade paying for it. The problem was that PSR became incredibly complicated. Fans weren't just talking about whether their club could afford a player anymore. We were talking about amortisation, book value, accounting profit, PSR deadlines, pure profit. You'd open social media during the transfer window and suddenly everyone had apparently completed an accountancy degree. And more importantly, the clubs themselves started making decisions around the rules. Academy players became particularly valuable financially because selling a homegrown player can create immediate accounting profit. Transfer structures became increasingly important, and suddenly a transfer window wasn't simply about how much money does my club have, it was how much PSR headroom does my club have, and the Premier League wanted something different. And from 2026 to 2027, they've got it. What actually is SCR? SCR stands for Squad Cost Ratio. And forget the complicated name. The basic concept is actually fairly straightforward. Instead of primarily asking, how much money has this club lost, we're now essentially asking, how much of the money available to this club is being spent on its squad? Under the Premier League's new system, the key green threshold is 85%. Very broadly, SCR compares relevant squad costs against football revenue and the relevant player sale result. Squad costs include things like player and head coach wages, agent fees, and the accounting costs of transfers through amortisation and impairment. But here's an important point before we go any further. 85% is not a transfer budget, and later we'll talk about UEFA's 70% rule that isn't a transfer budget either. The Premier League and UEFA calculations also aren't identical. Throughout this video, I'm going to simplify some of the examples to explain the principle. Whenever I do, I'll make that clear. Now, the easiest way to understand SCR is with a simplified example. Imagine a club has 200 million within the relevant calculation, At 85%, that would give you £170 million. If the relevant base were 400 million, 85% would give you 340 million. At 600 million, 510 million again. Those are simplified illustrations, but they're not actually club spend limits, but they demonstrate the central principle. The larger revenue base and the larger potential squad cost capacity, there's another important detail here too. The Premier League's 85% figure is the green threshold. It isn't simply a hard wall where a club reaches 85% and suddenly it isn't allowed to spend any money anymore. The new system includes a multi-year allowance above that level. Clubs begin with the additional headroom of up to 30%, effectively creating an initial red threshold of 115%. Using that additional allowance can trigger a levy and reduce the allowance available in future seasons. And going beyond the permitted red threshold can lead to sporting sanctions. So when I talk about 85% throughout this video, I'm talking about the Premier League's core green threshold, not pretending it's a simple, hard transfer cap. Europe and UEFA's 70%. But there's another layer, because clubs playing in UEFA competitions also have UEFA's financial rules to worry about. UEFA has its own squad cost rule, and its limit is 70%. Again, I want to be precise here. The Premier League's 85% and UEFA's 70% aren't simply two percentages applied to the exact same spreadsheet. The calculations differ. But clubs subject to the UEFA cost control requirements have to comply with UEFA's 70% squad cost framework. And importantly, the Premier League has actually thought about this difference. One reason it gives domestic clubs more headroom at 85% is to help clubs outside European competitions compete against clubs receiving European revenue, and to help with the transition if a club fails to qualify for Europe. That's important because it shows the Premier League isn't ignoring competitive balance. The question I'm interested in is whether those mechanisms are enough. Why SCR makes sense? Because what's the alternative? Should somebody be allowed to buy a Premier League club tomorrow and immediately pump £1 billion into the squad? I'm not convinced that they should. We've seen throughout football what can happen when a club's spending becomes dependent on an owner consistently injecting money. What happens when that owner gets bored? What happens when they run out of money? What happens if they sell? The players still have contracts. The wages still need paying. Transfer instalments don't disappear. The football club remains. So linking spending to sustainable revenue is conceptually a sensible idea. And that's why I don't think the conversation should simply be financial rules are bad, let owners spend what they want. I don't believe that. There absolutely should be some financial regulation. There should be protection against reckless ownership. And clubs should have to demonstrate that their spending is sustainable. My issue isn't with the existence of SCR. My question is, what happens when revenue becomes such an important part of determining sustainable squad costs? Because Premier League clubs do not start from equal commercial positions, not even remotely. Bournemouth, testing the principle. Bournemouth are a really useful club to test this principle against. Not because Bournemouth prove SCR is unfair, they don't, but because they're almost a perfect example of an ambitious Premier League club trying to go from a much smaller commercial starting point. Look at the Vitality Stadium. Bournemouth have been competing in the richest domestic football league in the world, in a stadium holding only around 11,000 people. Man United get more than 70,000 into Old Trafford. Liverpool have expanded Anfield beyond 60,000. Tottenham Stadium holds more than 60,000. Bournemouth operate on a completely different scale, and under a revenue-linked system that does matter. In Bournemouth's 2024 to 2025 accounts, the revenue is around 182 million. Around 148 million came from Premier League central distributions. That's more than 80% of their revenue coming from that one source. Their ability to generate matchday income is naturally restricted by the stadium. And that's hardly because Bournemouth have decided, you know what, we actually really fancy selling more tickets. They physically can't put 60,000 people in the stadium because they don't have 60,000 seats. And Bournemouth are trying to change that. Their phased redevelopment of the Vitality Stadium is ultimately intended to make the capacity around 20,000 people. And this is something SCR actually gets right. SCR is deliberately focused on on-pitch squad costs. It gives clubs much greater freedom to invest off the pitch in things like stadium upgrades. That's exactly what we should want. If Bournemouth want to spend money expanding their stadium so they can eventually generate more matchday income and conversion revenue, the rules shouldn't punish them for doing that. But here's the problem. You can build another 9,000 seats, you can improve your commercial operation, you can invest in infrastructure, but you can't create generations of global support overnight. The revenue gap. And this is where the scale becomes enormous. Manchester City reported revenue of around £715 million for 2023 to 2024. Liverpool reported £614 million for the same season. Bournemouth's roughly £182 million comes from figures from 2024-2025. So these aren't identical accounting periods, and I'm not presenting this as a perfect like-for-like league table. I'm using them to demonstrate scale. And the scale is extraordinary. Liverpool reported £308 million commercially, £204 million from the media, and £102 million from match days. Liverpool's matchday revenue alone was more than half of Bournemouth's entire revenue figure. And I'm not saying Liverpool have done anything wrong. It's quite the opposite. They built one of the biggest football clubs in the world. They've expanded Anfield. They've built enormous commercial partnerships. They have generations of supporters around the world. They should benefit from making good decisions. But here's the question. Should those enormous existing commercial advantages also mean they can sustainably maintain dramatically higher squad costs indefinitely? Europe, reward and restriction. European qualification makes this even more interesting because qualifying for Europe brings money. UEFA prize money, performance bonuses, extra home matches, more exposure, potentially more commercial opportunities, and the additional European income matters. So we shouldn't frame UEFA's 70% rule as you qualify for Europe and suddenly you're punished. That isn't fair. European football can be enormously valuable, but qualifying for UEFA competition also brings UEFA's stricter cost control rules framework into equation. So sporting success can bring both more revenue and additional regulatory constraints. And the biggest Premier League clubs in Europe face those UEFA rules too. Manchester City don't get a free pass, Liverpool, Arsenal don't get a free pass, but once again, the underlying question remains. A percentage applied to the huge revenue bases gives you a very different financial position from a percentage applied to a much smaller one. The percentage can't be equal. The starting point isn't. The potential feedback loop. And this is where I think there's a legitimate risk of worth discussing. Imagine the established giant, huge stadium, global fan base, massive commercial revenue that supports a much larger, sustainable squad cost. That can help support a deeper squad. A deeper squad can improve your chances of competing domestically and qualifying for Europe. European football brings additional revenue and exposure. That can help with commercial growth, which increases revenue again. Now look at the ambitious smaller club. Smaller stadium, smaller commercial operation, smaller revenue base, potentially less squad cost flexibility, less margins for recruit mistakes, harder to establish yourself consistently in Europe, less additional revenue, and potentially slower commercial growth. I'm not saying SCR guarantees that cycle. Football is far too unpredictable for that. But I do think there's a legitimate question about whether revenue-linked squad controls could reinforce some of the financial equality that already exists. The best argument against me. Now, the strongest argument against everything I've just said is actually pretty simple. Why shouldn't clubs spend what they earn? Liverpool built their revenue, Man United built their global audience, Tottenham invested enormous amounts into their stadium, Arsenal built the Emirates. Why should those clubs be prevented from benefiting from that success? And that's completely a legitimate argument. There's another point too. Money doesn't guarantee competence. A club can generate enormous revenue and still recruit badly. Meanwhile, clubs like Brighton, Brentford and Bournemouth have shown that intelligent recruiting can outperform far bigger budgets. So SCR doesn't make competition impossible, and I don't want to pretend that it does. What it potentially changes is the margin for error. A major recruitment mistake hurts everyone, but a 15 million annual squad cost mistake is much easier to absorb when your revenue base is enormous than when it isn't. The player trading question. And that brings us to another way smaller clubs can grow: player trading. Bournemouth recorded around 91 million in profit from player disposals in 2024-2025 accounts. That's brilliant business. Recruit intelligently, develop players, sell at a profit, reinvest. But there's an interesting sporting tension there. Imagine finding an elite centre-back for 10 million, you develop him, 3 years later he's worth 60 million. Financially, selling him could be incredibly attractive. But sporting success eventually requires keeping elite players too. So you've got a decision. Keep him and potentially strengthen your squad to push towards Europe, or sell him, generate profit and reinvest. Again, the accounting treatment is more complicated than simply saying 50 million profit equals 50 million extra spending. It doesn't. But the broader sporting question remains: at what point does a brilliant development and sales model become a pathway to catching the elite? And at what point does it make you an incredibly successful supplier of players to them? Because clubs inherit completely different revenue generating platforms. Stadium size matters. Historical success matters. Global support matters. Commercial networks matter. Location can matter. European participation matters. That's not the fault of the bigger clubs, and it's not necessarily evidence that the smaller clubs are badly run. It's simply the reality of football. And that's why spend what you earn sounds incredibly fair, until you ask how equally distributed the ability to earn actually is. What SCR gets right, and I want to emphasise this again, SCR does get important things right. It links squad spending to sustainable club finances. It gives clubs greater freedom to invest off the pitch. The 85% green threshold gives domestic clubs more headroom than UEFA 70%. And the Premier League explicitly says part of that is intended to help clubs compete for European qualification. So the Premier League clearly has thought about this problem. My question isn't, have they considered competitive balance? They have. My question is, are the mechanisms they've created enough? There's no easy alternative. And designing something better isn't easy. Unlimited owner investment creates obvious risk. An identical spending cap for every club creates its own fairness problems. And the Premier League considered another mechanism called top to bottom anchoring, which didn't receive enough support. So I'm not sitting there pretending there's an obvious perfect alternative. There isn't. Final verdict. So do I think SCR is a bad idea? No. I actually think the principle makes a lot of sense. Football clubs shouldn't build squads they fundamentally cannot afford. Owners shouldn't be able to gamble the future of clubs chasing short-term success. And clubs should be encouraged to invest sustainably in infrastructure and long-term growth. Those are good things. But I don't think we should confuse financial sustainability with competitive fairness. They're not the same question. SCR might make Premier League clubs more financially sustainable. That doesn't automatically mean it makes the Premier League more competitive. And I don't know whether SCR will ultimately make the league less competitive. Nobody does yet. But I do think there's a legitimate question about whether linking sustainable squad spending to revenue risks reinforcing financial advantages that already exist, and whether the Premier League safeguard gives ambitious smaller clubs enough room to overcome them. Because if Bournemouth recruit brilliantly, develop brilliant players, expand their stadium, grow commercially, reach Europe, and make brilliant decisions, I want there to be a realistic pathway where they can eventually turn into a sustained sporting growth. Not simply a model for where they become incredibly good at developing players for clubs whose revenue they can never realistically approach. Maybe SCR works brilliantly. Maybe 5 years from now we'll look back and say this is exactly what the Premier League finances needed. But if the richest clubs can permanently sustain dramatically larger squads because they permanently generate dramatic larger revenues, then we may have solved one problem while reinforcing another. So what do you think? Is linking squad costs to revenue the fairest way to protect the Premier League clubs? Or does it risk making the existing financial hierarchy even harder to break? And if you were designing the rules, what would you change? Let me know in the comments. And if you've enjoyed this deeper dive type of football video, subscribe to Matchday Unfiltered because I've got plenty more coming.